Hello, hi everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. Welcome everybody. Welcome to the LSE Anthropology department, and welcome to our weekly time-honored research seminar on anthropological theory. Been running since the time of Bronislaw Malinowski, 90 or so odd years, I think. I'm Alpa Shah. I'm a professor of anthropology here, and I'm chairing this 2021 Michaelmas term seminar series. From today, we're going to devote the rest of this term's seminars to pay tribute to our dear friend and our colleague, David Graeber. It's been very difficult for us to come to terms with David's loss last September. Not only was it very sudden and very shocking, it also happened during the time of the COVID lockdowns, when grieving together was so challenging, and in fact still remains the case for so many. Over time, I personally have come to feel that it is true that sometimes the dead are more alive than the living. And with David on your own, it certainly feels this way. And I hope this seminar series is also a testament to that. David joined this department in 2013. I believe he was genuinely happy here, even if sometimes he got annoyed that he had made an effort to turn up to this particular seminar, but couldn't ask his question because he raised his hand too late. When David passed away, after the Zoom commemoration we held as a department, we decided that we would honor his work in this series by each week inviting two relevant leading anthropologists to critically engage with and comment on different aspects of it. David is a hugely influential public intellectual and a political activist, but above all, he wanted to be seen as an anthropologist and treated seriously as an anthropologist. And that is what we will be doing in this series. David's work was wide-ranging, from debt to pirates, bureaucracy to bullshit jobs, kings to reworking the teleological assumptions of the history of humanity. I'm referring to the important book with David Graeber, which was published on Monday, and which we launched from the department last week. It's impossible for us to cover everything in this series, but we've picked a few of his important works. We begin this week with David's initiation as an anthropologist, his first book. I think the only book that was based on, deep kind of ethnographic research, lost people, magic, and the legacy of slavery in Madagascar. And that grew out of the fieldwork that he conducted for his PhD and was published in 2007 by Indiana University Press. We are very fortunate that Professor Jonathan Parry and Professor Maurice Bloch, who are both now emeritus professors in the department, have agreed to tell us about and discuss this book. David saw Johnny and Maurice as the pair that had together significantly shaped the anthropology department here, both through their own research and their collaboration and their friendship over two significant anthropological volumes, Death and the Regeneration of Life and Money and the Morality of Exchange. David himself had aspirations at one point to be creating such collaborations here himself. Maurice was also someone who David knew extremely well since he was a PhD student. They shared, the island of Madagascar as a field site. I think David would be truly delighted, smiling with glee, in fact, to have Maurice and Johnny commenting on the lost people. So Johnny and Maurice, thank you for taking on this task, which I know has been challenging for both of you for similar and different reasons. Maurice is, in fact, I hope he's going to be able to join us. He's kind of listening in on my phone here from Libourne in hospital. Johnny is with us right now. But yes, it's been challenging to take this task on. And I suggested to both of them yesterday that let's just, cancel this particular seminar and we can opt out. But they both insisted that, they wanted to be with us today and proceed. I think it's appropriate that we are doing that. Its seminar is very much a kind of ritual event for us all to be together and to be with David, with and without the limitations of Zoom. Zoom means that so many more people can be with us too. So there are many of us today here, and it's wonderful to see you all. Thank you for coming. We will have, we will see how the seminar goes. I will pass it over to Johnny first to tell us about the book, and then hopefully we'll be able to have Morris in some form with us too. And after that, we will have questions, and please feel, or comments even, comments will probably be more appropriate. Please feel free to write them out in chat as we go along, and we will try to raise them and also invite some of you to raise them. Before I hand over to Johnny and Morris, I would like to say a word of thanks to Dr. Giulio Ongaro, Dr. Megan Laws, and Dr. Becky Bowers for brainstorming the series with me. I'd like to say thanks to Renata Todd in the department office for ensuring, everything that's gone into its smooth execution, and also to Professor Matthias Peltmans for helping me behind the scenes in the hosting of these events. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Morris and Johnny. Johnny, over to you first.
Good, thanks. Am I audible? Yeah. So as Alpa has said, David's Lost People started life as his University of Chicago PhD thesis, but it wasn't actually published until 2007, when he'd already put out 2 important books. To my shame, I have to admit that I hadn't actually read Lost People until Alpa twisted my arm to speak on this occasion. And having read it, I realize how incompetent I am to talk about it, because I'm not a specialist on Madagascar, and nor am I expert on the literature on slavery or on history and narrative. But it's worse than that. Something that I've always very much admired David for is the incredible clarity of his writing and his ability to say things that seem deeply obvious once he's said them, but were never obvious before, or at least not to me. And several of the reviewers of Lost People congratulate him on its literary quality. So I guess that I'm out on a limb, because I actually found that by David's very high standards, it was rather heavy going, and it was the narrative is rather labyrinthine, and the detail distinctly overwhelming. So I was often not entirely sure that I was getting the point. David himself describes it as an experimental book, a kind of cross between an ethnography and a long Russian novel. The aspiration was to produce a dialogic ethnography that would do away with the distance between author and informants that is created, as David sees it, by much social science writing. As I'll later explain, he here draws a sharp distinction between social scientists and historians, and identifies himself squarely with the historians. His sympathies are with what he represents as old-style ethnography, where the objective is to provide a window on a way of life, rather than to deploy ethnography, as is currently usual, as a prop for some single theoretical argument. He wants his Malagasy interlocutors to emerge as both actors in history and as historians. Despite the difficulties of his text, it's relatively easy to say what it's centrally about and to summarize its main narrative. In case there's anybody present who hasn't actually read it or whose memories need refreshing, that's what I'm going to try and do. So it's centrally about slavery, about its local history, and more especially about its post-abolition legacy. Above all, that is, it's about the past and the present, about the ways in which history impinges on contemporary relations between people of free and of slave descent in a rural area in the Western Highlands of Madagascar, an hour or so drive from the capital, Antananarivo. Petafu, his field site, is in Imarina, the old kingdom of the Mariner people, who ruled most of the island in the 19th century, and of whom Maurice Bloch has written with such distinction. David's main window on these slave descent, exnoble relationships is through the narrative of an ordeal that was held in 1987 that provoked the ancestors, resulted in disaster for the main protagonists, and ended by dividing the community even more deeply than it had been divided before. This narrative threads all the way through the book with new interpretations, new perspectives, and new details endlessly piling up over 400 pages. Petafu, which is something like a parish, is made up of about 15 hamlets, scattered hamlets, which have a population of a floating population of 300 to 500. It's locally notorious for witchcraft and sorcery, and for the hostility of relations between its inhabitants. A major reason for selecting it, David reports. In the 1980s, it experienced an epidemic of petty thefts. The village assembly decided to hold an ordeal to identify the culprits. The villagers were to drink water in which earth from the ancestors' tombs had been dissolved. But since they weren't all of the same ancestry, there were nobles and ex-slaves who were in principle totally separate groups between whom marriage was theoretically impossible. The earth should come from two separate tombs. And even that was a political fudge for the reason that not all the people of slave descent were of one descent group, though that's how the procedure adopted for the ordeal made them appear. Nor was this provocative mixing of the earth the only dangerous blunder. It turns out that both of the elders who had instigated and organized the ordeal, one noble, one slave, had recently taken a wife from the other group. They were guilty of mixing bodily fluids and bloods as well. No wonder disaster followed. The rice had just been harvested and was still in the fields. A flash flood swept it away. Actually, it later transpired that it was only the crops of the two elders that were completely destroyed. This was in 1987. David started his research 3 years later and witnessed the aftermath. The ordeal, which had been intended to reassert communal solidarity, had provoked a definitive rift. Now blacks, slave descendants, were avoiding white, that is noble parts of Petafu, and were exploiting their reputation for magical powers and knowledge of local taboos to harass and constrain Petafu nobles who had moved to the capital, but who were now threatening to return to the village and resume their lands. In parentheses, I should perhaps say that by standards elsewhere, the levels of the antagonism seemed fairly muted. Returnee nobles might be told that there was a taboo on taking water from a particular spring, but they weren't physically attacked or forcibly prevented from moving back home. Intermarriage was anathematized, but we nevertheless hear of quite a few instances. None had resulted in murder, nor even in serious boycott. Compare rural Bihar or Haryana, where couples who have contracted such serious misalliances could never be sure of their safety. Even in 18th century Madagascar, slavery and slave trading had a prominent role in many local economies. In the 19th century, however, slavery really took off in a spectacular way in Amarina after the British had done a deal with the Mariner king by which he agreed to halt the international trade of slaves for guns on the understanding that the British would give him the guns anyway and would not supply his rivals. That enabled the Mariner state to dominate most of the island and to capture more and more slaves. They were deployed on public works and in agriculture in the Mariner heartlands, from where more and more Mariner went as soldiers. Later in the century, perhaps as many as half of Marina's population were slaves, according to Bloch. It was, in any event, an enormous proportion, and that had a profound impact on Mariner society and cultural representations. The French annexed Madagascar in 1895 and abolished slavery in 1897. From Petafu, many nobles moved off to the capital to join the civil service, a few to Paris. Their former slaves became their sharecroppers and generally thrived. That was widely attributed to their manipulation of their magical powers. The downward mobility of many nobles was put down to the sins of slavery, even by the nobles themselves. Nobles were increasingly deeply divided between a rich elite who largely moved out and the poor who largely remained. David offers a vivid picture of just how opulent and aristocratic these rich nobles were in the early years of the colonial period, with their twilight parties, music and dancing, and their colorful silk garments and golden diadems. Still at the time of his fieldwork, émigré nobles would descend on Petafu in numbers to collect a share of the harvest or to bury some kinsman in the ancestral tomb. When a corpse was flown in from Paris, the paths were jammed with cars and vans, and in their hundreds, everywhere around the tomb, were knots of grave-looking men in three-piece suits with expensive watches, ladies in silk dresses, pearls, gold and silver jewelry. Within village society, however, the fundamental division, regardless of class, remained that between Andriana, nobles, and Andevo, slaves. Though the topic of slavery was avoided, nobody could ever forget it, and slaves were still associated with pollution and ideas of contamination. Crucially, however, the situation of many of these emigre nobles became seriously precarious after the 1972 revolution. Subsequent to it, the peasant sector was badly neglected. The government took vast loans for development, which it could not service, resulting in insolvency, dependence on the IMF, structural adjustment, the slashing of state budgets, the withdrawal of welfare and services from the countryside, a catastrophic collapse in living standards, and widespread pauperization. The state largely withdrew from places like Petafu, leaving them as temporary or autonomous zones. At the same time, many metropolitan civil servants were badly impoverished and were tempted to move back to their ancestral villages to resume the land that their ex-slave sharecroppers had been cultivating. And that, of course, is the essential background to the tensions that resulted from the Petafu ordeal at the heart of David's book. What that background significantly qualifies, as it seems to me, is David's claim to represent his informants as both actors in history and as historians. Of course, they're actors in a limited sense, but as actors, they're highly constrained and they have little autonomy. By that, I mean to suggest that the most important part of the story that explains why Petafu's Andriana and Andevo are at each other's throats takes place offstage between the Malagasy state and the IMF in the capital and its corridors of power. That is what really drives the story. And that bit of it is pure Graeber. It has no part in his informant's narratives, which are, as it were, epiphenomenal. They're a derivative discourse that is somehow beside the main point. As historians, they were severely limited by having no access to sources that would give them a proper handle on that crucial background. That's no doubt a rather crude way of introducing a more general reservation about David's preoccupation with narrative. Nobody could possibly doubt its importance for history and politics, but Lost People repeatedly seems to claim that that is what history and politics are. I worry that that leaves an awful lot out. If history is mainly, as David says it is, about the circulation of stories, what of all the ecological, epidemiological, and demographic influences on our lives of which we are often unconscious? If political action is, I quote, action that is intended to be recorded or narrated or in some way represented to others afterwards, what kind of action is all that effort that goes into ensuring that so many of the deeds and misdeeds of our rulers are never recorded? Representations, discourses, and narratives are unarguably important, but they should not, in my view, be allowed to occupy all the space in an anthropological analysis. In a podcast discussion of David's debt book, chaired by Gillian Tett, sometime after his death, one contributor astutely observed that if there's one value that informed his work, it's that of freedom. That made me wonder how Lost People fits in. Though it says little about freedom explicitly, the ethnography overwhelmingly suggests its absence. This is a society that seems entirely unable to escape its past. In David's other writings, there is usually some possibility of escape from oppression that is provided by other ideological alternatives. Here, the past seems almost inescapably tyrannical. the mariner condemned to continually renew the legacy of guilt and resentment that stems from their history of slavery. And whether or not David intended us to put the two things together, his ethnography also shows that the burden of the past goes well beyond that. The mariner ancestors play a significant role in the lives of their descendants. And in Bloch's writings, the role of the influence of these ancestors, it's somewhat equivocal, but it's mainly benign. In Lost People, the ancestors come over as distinctly threatening. They're always telling the living what they can't do, and they're regularly attacking them. That provokes the resentment and hostility of the living, which are dramatically expressed in the secondary burial, when the ancestral remains are assaulted, their bones are crushed up, their dust is bound tightly in wrappings, and they're securely locked back in their tombs once more. History, it seems, is some kind of prison against the walls of which the living can only bang their heads. Marx had already summed it up brilliantly. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. All that prompts a series of comparative questions that I think important, but that David passes by. Largely, I suspect, because they fall outside the narrative frame of his informants. Crucially, why, well after a century since manumission, are the mariner still so obsessed by slavery? Partly, no doubt, on account of its scale and its cruelty, but there's surely more to it than that. Recent contributions to the regional literature have drawn attention to wide variations between Malagasy societies in the degree to which slave descent remains stigmatized, in the extent to which they appear to be haunted by its history, and in whether they're willing to speak of it at all. Margaret Brown and Denis Renier and Dominique Somda make brave stabs at specifying the conditions that might explain that variation. Differences in social structure, resources, ethnic mixing and migration, and according to whether the slaves were of Malagasy or of African origin. While Luke Freeman writes illuminatingly about the mandatory silence on the subject of slavery amongst his Betsileo informants, and of how that silence re-entrenches the stigma of slavery by making it literally unspeakable. Moving right across to the other side of the Indian Ocean, the legacy of slavery in Sri Lanka is dramatically different. According to Neera Wickramasinghe's recent book, the collective memory of slavery has in Sri Lanka been almost totally obliterated. True, it was never on quite the same scale, and it was abolished some decades earlier than in Madagascar. But on her analysis, on the Ceylon side, the comparison would have to include the way in which the creolization brought about by slavery seriously challenged doctrines of racial purity in the South, and the way in which the enslavement of Tamil untouchables by high caste Tamil Vellalas subverted later political projects of Tamil nationalism in the North. But questions of that comparative order are no part of David's inquiry. The broader terrain on which he does locate his study, my final observation, concerns rather the relationship between history and the social sciences. I confess I find his pitch a bit puzzling, and I'm hoping someone might help me clarify it. What he postulates is a broad contrast between the concerns of social science, which have primarily to do with patterns of regularity and predictability, and the concerns of history, which deals with the irregular and the unpredictable. It's the record of those actions which are not simply cyclical, repetitive, or inevitable. Anthropology should align itself with history. That seems to be above all because it's the very concern with science, laws, and regularities that's been responsible for creating the sense of distance that David says he's been trying so hard to efface. It is, paradoxically enough, the desire to seem objective that has largely been responsible for creating the impression that the people we study are some exotic, alien, ultimately unknowable other. Personally, I don't believe any of that. But what interests me more is whether you might be able to tell me whether this disciplinary opposition has resonances in David's other work. Or is it, as I suspect, an opportunistic answer to the requirement that he justify and explain the literary style he's adopted in writing this book? Certainly, his book on debt seems to be larded with social science type propositions about repetitive, predictable patterns. Slavery played a key role in the rise of markets everywhere. Bullion currency predominates in periods of generalized violence. Coinage, slavery, markets, and the state go inexorably together, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny, for raising a whole number of questions about the lost people, for taking this task so seriously as David would have wanted, and I'm hoping that there are people in this room who are going to help us address some of the questions that Johnny raises. Before we do that, engage in a conversation, I'm going to hand over to Morris, who is actually here on this phone, listening in. We've been unable to get him on the Zoom conversation, but I think Morris has heard. Morris, have you heard what Johnny said?
Most of it.
Most of it. Okay. So now, can people hear Morris if he speaks on this phone? Morris, can you speak, please?
Here I speak.
Maybe a little bit further, take it a bit further away, like that maybe. That's
okay.
fine.
Great. I'm confident that we can make this work. I've been doing these extraordinary interviews in India with translators and all on like WhatsApp and with translator in one place, part of India, and me here. And anyway, we can make this work, Morris. Yes?
Yes. Well, if you can hear me.
I can hear you. I think that the crowd can hear you too. So I think over to you, Morris, please. Yes, the floor is yours.
All right. I'm not sure how much you can hear me, nor how much you know about Madagascar. But let me say a few general things. The area where David was working was an area which, if you looked at it locally, was being taken over by the descendants of slaves who were themselves being infiltrated by outsiders, and therefore, and who were, as hard as they could, trying not to have themselves identified as slaves. So there's one group which looks very, very successful in David's work, which is basically the descendants of slaves taking over the area. The other group are hardly present, apart from some of David's friends, and they are the descendants of free people who either have gone back to the countryside and seem to have very little influence, or are in the capital, Antananarivo, or in France. So the story is basically of these people were treating while the descendants of the slaves taking over. This would be very simple if that was all there was to it. But of course, the area that David was working in was part of the changing Madagascar situation. The big changes were that the government was becoming more and more close to the descendants of slaves and trying to do in as much as they could of the free. Neither of them. The descendants of the slaves are not really successful because they're continually trying to identify themselves with away from their slave ancestry and more linked up with people from outside the area. The descendants of the free are not successful because they're just leaving. The only descendants of the free that are in the area where David was working were a few failures who had to come back because they had nowhere else to go. So if that was the whole story, the story is very simple. It is of the descendants of the slaves taking over an area. Things, however, are not so simple. They're not so simple because this is Madagascar and tombs are very, very important. And the important tombs are all said important tombs of the people who were never slaves and who want to reassert their domination. So the descendants of slaves and other people as well who are mixed in with them are can be seen trying to take the place over. The descendants of the free are only interested in the tombs and the people who were buried there. Neither side are going to win, and indeed neither side did win. The descendants of the slaves do succeed in taking the rice fields, the means of production over and controlling them away from those few odds and sods who were coming back defeated, basically, to the area. Yet there's something odd about the book, in that the book really wants to talk about the descendants of the slaves, but in fact talks most of the time about the descendants of the free, who are these defeated people who are just coming back. So locally, the situation is simple. It's descendants of slaves who are taking over. The descendants of the free are being pushed out. There's, however, a complication, and that is that the descendants of the free are linked with the great tombs that were once in the area and which are sort of haunting the place all the time. This haunting by the descendants of the free seems to have very little significance for most of the story until the descendants of the slaves get above their status. They want to take the place over, descendants of the free are trying to reassert their status, and to a certain extent, they succeed in doing so. They are very largely outside the area where David worked. They're in the capital, in Tenerife. Indeed, quite a lot of them are in France. And they really couldn't care less about the descendants of the slaves. So locally, the descendants of the slaves seem to be winning on a wider scale. The descendants of the free are sort of haunting the place, haunting it until they actually come back in the ancestral rituals which are being organized. What the descendants of the slaves are hoping is that they can somehow take over these ancestral rituals and dominate that way through the power of the descendants of the free. They fail. They fail totally for various reasons which are well explained in the book. The descendants of the free, on the other hand, turn up at these great rituals in their cars, in their vans, trying to impress the locals as much as possible. And to a certain extent, succeed. Behind that, there's the shadow of the state, which actually, oddly enough, is on the side of the descendants of the slaves. So the third element are the people in the tomb, the dead people who are being activated by the descendants of the free. It's the conflict between all these three groups, which have quite different interests, which is a story of the book. Largely, it talks about the descendants of the slaves winning, because they are winning locally. It also, and certainly the other free which are there, are definitely not winning. They're a sort of odds and sods. And there's the third group, which is almost outside the area where David works, which is in Tenerife and partly in France, which are much better educated, much richer, and much more powerful. So in the end, the story is that these outsider groups who come in for the rituals are going to be taking over. Three groups: one, the local, where the slaves are winning; then the free, where the descendants of the free were just almost an irrelevance; and thirdly, the tombs, which the ancestors of the free are there, and through which they are going to exercise a local power. That's a very, very complicated situation, made much more complicated by the fact that political changes are taking place in Madagascar during the whole of this period.
Maurice, thank you. Thanks so much for actually providing the kind of wider frame to what is going on in this very complex book. I wanted to start the conversation by asking you whether you may be able to enlighten us on some of the issues raised by Johnny, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about the comparative where David was, how does the situation of slaves compare with, you know, the other ethnographies we have in Madagascar? Luc Freeman, Denis Rainier, Dominic Sander. I mean, how, you know, if we think about David's situation in a comparative context, the questions that Johnny was, you know, saying are kind of basically missing in David's consideration. Of course, some of these people are writing after David. I mean, what light does the work of these other ethnographies shed on the particularity or the similarity of David's own research context?
Well, David's work was local in many ways. It's very much focused on where he was, and so he oscillates between the success that the slaves were having locally and the haunting of the ex-free in the rest of Madagascar, and indeed even in France. Do you hear me?
Yes, yeah, okay. Maurice, we can pick up maybe on some of this later.
All the other ethnographies that you mentioned are irrelevant. Even my ethnography, because my ethnography concerns an area where there were no established lords with their tombs.
Okay, thanks Maurice. It would be good to continue this, but there are so many people in the room with us who I'm sure have got comments, things that they would like to address, talk about. We decided earlier that if you could please put your comments in the chat, and we will ask you we will raise some of them from the chat to be raised in the room itself. While people are kind of gathering their thoughts, I wondered if I could invite David Wengrow into the conversation, because I know, David, that you have to go soon, but I think one of the issues that Johnny raises at the end of his conversation, it would be at the end of his discussion, it would be wonderful for us to have your insights into the final issue that Johnny raised in relation to his observations about David's perspectives on the relationship between history and the social sciences. Now, this is clearly something that you would have talked about, or you would have addressed, or you would have been in the sidelines of the writing of The Dawn of Everything. And you know, Johnny's, just to remind you of Johnny's. Yeah, okay. So what then is, you know, what then is a relationship between history and social sciences, and how does that inform the writing of The Dawn of Everything? Is it in line with what Johnny suggested was the case in The Lost People, or have perspectives changed? What you know, what is the relationship?
I'm surprised that Johnny pulled that out as a particular issue from this book, which I had to go back to and try to start rereading. It's a long time since I looked at it. It seems to me, from other things I've been reading from contemporary anthropologists, that the big sort of surprising issue methodologically here is that on the one hand, we've got social am I audible, by the way? I better just check.
Yes, you are.
We've got social anthropologists all over the place. I've been reading pieces by James Laidlaw, Joel Robbins, Webb Keane, claiming that social anthropology has had nothing to say about freedom. But here we've got two eminent social anthropologists talking about a book written a long time ago, as if it's perfectly obvious that here we have a rich ethnography and ethnohistory of freedom. So I'm not sure what to make of that. They can't all be right. But if lost people is that, then I think the relationships to David's later work and his much more generalizing work on history becomes a bit clearer, because what he's describing here, with a rich historical background that Morris has helped to flesh out, is a moment in time. As Johnny says, you know, a century after manumission may not be a very long time in structural and psychological terms, even after the material conditions of slavery are gone. I think an interesting way to read David's ethnography in light of what he went on to write about in depth and in our work and in other places is what are the non-material conditions that prevent a discourse on freedom from emerging. And something he went back to a lot in his later writings is the really durable structural effects of concepts of freedom, such as those of the European tradition, which are rooted in slave relations. So even after the material, it's not his point entirely, it's a point that was famously made by the Jamaican sociologist who was at LSE, in fact, Orlando Patterson, in a number of books in the 70s and 80s, that the effects of slavery on European concepts of freedom are still present in our systems of law, which are essentially the freedoms of the master. They're abstract legal freedoms which presuppose the existence of slaves in households and in the wider economy, even when those slaves are no longer that, even when they are theoretically free people. So these are freedoms based on or at the expense of another's captivity or another's suffering. And I think, at least to my mind, what I can detect in this ethnography are the beginnings of an interest in what another form or other forms of freedom might be, which are not that. But as Johnny conveys, what David seems to be describing is a moment in time in which those haven't emerged, and it would be a false projection, presumably on his part, as the ethnographer, to then claim that they exist or claim that he could predict their emergence. What he's describing, as you say, are people who seem imprisoned by their past, but maybe that unwillingness to actually develop concepts of freedom, which are in a sense transformations and extensions of the slave-master relationship, could in itself be significant in that way. In other words, I'm suggesting that perhaps what he's coming to understand or trying to get to grips with here is precisely why those kind of forms of freedom are not emerging, and that in itself may be interesting or significant, by contrast with our own broadly Western European notion of freedom, rooted in ancient Roman law, ancient Greek law, via various medieval intermediaries, if that makes sense at all. So it's not a direct answer to Johnny's point, but it didn't strike me that that was the sort of burning question.
Thanks, David. Yeah, you've taken us to freedom, but I guess the point that I was picking up from Johnny was the relationship between history.
I know. I think all those sorts of debates are not hugely interesting. I mean, you know, David was often struck by the profound absurdity and silliness of people who sort of, you know, they do things that look scientific and there's lots of graphs and statistics, but essentially what they're doing is predicting things that have already happened. You know, it's the point that Erwin Panofsky famously made, that, you know, with the sciences, everything's alive and in motion. The job of the scientist is to sort of temporarily freeze it so that you get a sort of snapshot. Whereas with the historian, everybody's dead, and the historian's job is to bring it to life. And you know, there's no getting around that. It's a hermeneutic. It's just a fact of research. So you know, what I see in David's book is an unwillingness to simplify and an unwillingness to set up pretentious sorts of boundaries to his work. It's a very vulnerable kind of ethnography. You know, he talks about people who are his friends. And, yeah.
Just to add one thing here, and that is that locally, the descendants of slaves mixed with other people from outside are winning. Nationally, they're not, because the people in the tombs are linked with people who are dominant in the capital and indeed internationally.
I guess that's the point that Johnny was also making, that the wider structural forces are taking place off stage, you know, the IMF, what's happened, you know, that these guys have gone off to Paris and are actually holding court from there over whatever they would like to hold court over. Productive assets can be handed over to the descendants. Anyway, we have actually got people from the floor. Fuad, you had raised your hand first, so can you please unmute yourself? And I know you put your comment in the chat as well, but it would be great to hear from you directly. Fuad first.
Sure, I think Yash put a comment in first, but unless they want to speak.
You had raised your hand first, Fuad, that's why I'm calling you up first. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, as I said in the comments, just some thoughts in terms of the questions that Johnny raised at the end. And it does seem to me that the question of genre, mode of writing and genre, is completely key to understanding at least that aspect of lost people. And I mean, some of this is coming from having taught with David, and particularly David's insistence on putting a week into the Intro to Anthropological Theory course that we taught together on dialogism. And at the time, before I'd read Lost People, I was interested, but I didn't fully understand why he was so insistent on this being a part of it. Latterly, it made a lot more sense to me. And it seems to me that the kind of question of what the book is doing is quite key on two ways. One, in terms of the question of historical actors and his interlocutors or cast of characters as historical actors. It put me in mind of David Scott's work on the Grenadian Revolution. And David Scott in that book talks a lot about his key figures as these tragic figures in a very strongly generic sense that they put into motion through their political choices, precisely the elements which will then bring their own personal downfall. And Scott's point on this is that really to act in the world in this kind of strongly agentive sense is to open yourself up to that possibility in the future. For David, I think the kind of point is much more, as Morris was saying, a more local version of this. But nevertheless, I think there's a way to read the events of 1987 and David then walking into the aftermath of that as one way of reading people and how they were interacting with one another and how they fit into the narrative of the story that David is telling, right? That they chose to act in this way, and here are the consequences that are being drawn up by David in this strongly intersubjective narrative mode, literary mode, right? Secondly, I think there's a point to be raised in terms of the question of dialogism strongly, which is that in the book and more broadly, David is insisting in the introduction, this is a sort of a narrative, a dialogic attempt to write an ethnography, and that knowledge and people's interactions are being produced in this very, very conversational mode that he is involved in, but people are with each other. And there's a lot of speech in the book, right? And I think that does link possibly more strongly to other of David's work and David's interest, because in a way, the ways in which people in Petafu understand what is happening is the product of these intersubjective interactions, contentious as they might be. And it's that produces knowledge, meaning for them. That's not to say that everything that is structurally happening and impinging upon them is not real or in a sense, conditioning what's happening, but it is that it seems to me anyway that the book is David trying to understand how people create meaning for themselves in this situation. One, if you like, tragically, where they are not fully in control of what is happening, but their own actions have been a part of how things then work out for them. in this period of time and the kind of expanse of the book. So I think genre is hugely important, and the genre that David is trying to write in and drawing from is hugely important. I guess the sort of question back more broadly, and maybe the question back to Johnny, would be, how much does that matter? Does that kind of strongly generic element invalidate the book, add to it? Does it then raise questions back to the kind of broader claims that David makes in the introduction? And then I think in the conclusion too, about the book's allegiance with history as opposed to social science perspectives. I think it maybe raises more questions of how it fits, but I think the genre element is key to understanding what David was doing in the book and why the book looks the way that it does.
Thanks, Fuad. I'm actually going to ask Yash Ladd and Megan Laws to also raise their questions or comments before I'll turn back to Johnny and Maurice at the end to add any extra additional reflections. And just as thinking about what you said, Fuad, I think that's really interesting and a good way to think about the book. But at the same time, I remember on reading the book and also speaking to David about it, that how much of the narrative is actually very dependent on one particular interlocutor, one particular person he was very close to and who helped him with so much of the research, actually two people in particular. So that, what happens to the dialogic nature of the production of the narrative and the script. Yeah.
Can I just add very, very quickly on that point, that I think that's another link possibly to certain kinds of Russian literary writing. This is not something I know huge amounts about, but these sort of petty noble figures who have come down in the world, or the world around them is changing, is this kind of very strong figure in Russian sort of writing of the 19th century. And we do have, like Maurice was saying, those kinds of figures who are also present. And it might even explain to a degree what Maurice was raising about the fact that we hear far more from those figures, the sort of descendants of sort of free people who are really incidental in a sense to the broader story. They're not the descendants of slaves, yet we hear so much more from them. I wonder whether that might be a reason as well as key interlocutors too. But anyway.
Thanks. Yash Ladd, would you mind unmuting yourself and
Sure thing. Apologies, my video is off, my connection's a little shaky, but yeah, I think this question might be slightly tangential to the discussion we're having, but I was mostly interested in just the question of ancestral authority. So, I think Maurice mentioned how the tombs of the ancestors of the nobles sanctioned their freedom within the village itself. And at the same time, I think within the ethnography, David mentions the family hang ceremonies where they take out the corpses of their ancestors and dance with them. And David's reading of that it's almost an attempt to speeden up the turning of the corpses into dust, so as to escape the weight of the ancestors. So I've just been wondering if there's a contradiction there, where on the one hand, the ancestors seem to sanction some sort of freedom for the descendants of the nobles. But at the same time, the nobles seem to be trying to free themselves from the ancestral authority through ceremonies like family hunts. So that was just my question, to see if there's a contradiction there, or if there's more to it.
Thanks, Yash. And then over to Megan before I hand over to Johnny and Maurice. Megan.
Yeah, sorry, just like a small comment. I think that just picking up on what David was saying, David Wengrow, sorry, about what David might have been trying to do in the book with regards to freedom, is that it seems to me that, and I don't know how this fits in with the broader criticism of evidence that Johnny is maybe bringing to the fore, that we might return to in later sessions during this seminar series, but he's quite kind of optimistic, or trying to be more optimistic, and by focusing on the kind of legacy of these narratives, and saying that that they have this sort of force. He's sort of also entertaining the reverse, which is that we could do away with those narratives, right? And I think that the descendants of slaves are then, as Maurice says, are trying to achieve that. They're trying to do away with the kind of narratives that then shape their lives in particular ways, and in ways that they don't want them to, right? So, and you see this a lot in a lot of David's work, that he's trying to essentially tell us that we could do things differently, right? That comes up a lot in his work, and he's trying to explore the role that narrative plays in that process. Now, what Johnny's criticism seems to raise to me is this broader question of the kind of conditions under which we find it possible to do that, which I think also comes up in the most recent book. When I'm thinking about some of the sort of arguments around freedom, I'm thinking about it in terms of my own research. I'm sort of struck with this feeling of like, well, why do people not do that? Why is it actually that we don't do that? So there seem to be some kind of conditions of possibility maybe for actually doing away with narrative, and that seems, or in that sense, or doing away with certain narratives. And yeah, so I think that, yeah, there's some sort of tension there, basically, that I think is and David's approach is like, well, we need to focus on narrative because we tend to overlook its power or centrality. Also, it's worth saying, just adding to Johnny's comment, I think David said once that this book was about 800 pages long when he first sent it to Indiana University Press. So you got the short version of this.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I think that's very useful, actually. Okay, we have just a few minutes left before the end of the seminar, so I'm going to hand over to Johnny and then Morris for any last reflections if they have any. Johnny, over to you first. You need to unmute yourself, Johnny. No, we can't hear you.
Yes.
Now we can hear you. Now you can start. Yes.
Thank you. I found all the comments really very, very interesting. I just respond to three of them very briefly. Going backwards, Megan. Very central in debt, for example, is that things could be done differently. There's all these three fundamental principles that organize the economy, and they can all be used to criticize each other and so on. But what I missed from Lost People was that kind of space. It seems to me that where in Lost People is that space represented and drawn attention to? I don't see it as terribly optimistic. All I see is these poor people endlessly reproducing this antagonism through the generations. So that's my response to Megan. To Yash, yeah, I think that what David is very strongly drawing attention to, which it comes across to me slightly differently from reading Morris, is just how nasty these ancestors are. I mean, in Morris, perhaps they're quite ambivalent, but they're always blowing water on people and giving them blessings. David's ancestors basically, are thoroughly disliked, it seems to me. There's a real sense of aggression against them in the secondary burial. To Fuad, I entirely agree that the mode of writing is absolutely key. But there was a question about its consequences. And I think that its consequences are the stress on narrative, to me, means that an awful lot that is sociologically, anthropologically important gets framed out of the fundamental questions. And that's why what I was trying to draw attention to with the comparative questions that I was asking. Bas.
Thanks, Johnny. Morris, would you like to add anything to close the conversation off?
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that it's a double colonial situation. The descendants of the slaves and other people mixed in are fighting the previous owners of the land, and Yes, so they're fighting them. But in fact, that's not where the real fight is. The real fight is between the more urban people and more urban people and local people. The more urban people in Madagascar who are talked about by David are total failures.
Okay, Maurice, thank you. With that, at 12:15, I want to thank everybody for coming on board today. Thank you so much. I want to thank Johnny and Maurice. Literally, I've spent the whole night thinking we don't have a seminar. We can't possibly have this seminar, but we're here and we've had this extraordinary conversation, which has definitely made me understand and think about this book in ways that I haven't before. And so I'm really, really grateful to Johnny and to Maurice and to all of you for participating. So thank you so much. Next week, we have Chris Gregory, who's here with us today, and Don Kalb on value. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, everybody.